Yes, they were relieved of the right of capital punishment, as mentioned earlier. And even Barrett admits it here. And it was reinforced by Pilate in this chapter in verse 6 and reinforced by the Jewish leaders in verse 7 here. They were forced into a crucifixion instead of their kinder, gentler stoning. A stoning that the unruly mob had attempted several times earlier, if you remember. A crucifixion that Pilate was reluctant to do in our previous chapter, and even more reluctant to do in this chapter, since we are told that his wife had a dream warning him of the dire consequences of having Jesus executed in Matthew 27. Yet it seems Pilate was more afraid of Caesar's wrath than the wrath of the Jews, afraid of reprisals from the mysterious emperor Tiberius, yes, the Caesar of that time. He was afraid of losing his cushy job in palace. Yep, in order to keep the peace. His job description was to keep the peace and collect taxes, of course. Or else lose his head for failing in his job description. Also, afraid of that decapitating fox Herod, who wanted to kill Jesus earlier. We read in Luke 13, we did Luke 13 a while back, who wanted to kill Jesus in his very own jurisdiction of Galilee up north. Although Herod is not mentioned here by John, Herod was currently in town. Yep, probably knowing that Jesus would be there. And Herod was also involved in the questioning of Jesus on this day. And he got no reply from Jesus. No reply at all. Herod was with the Roman soldiers of verse 2, dressing him up and mocking him, and laid a minor beating on Jesus before breakfast, before the major beating, following the reluctant sentencing of Jesus. But those are all circumstantial excuses for Pilate, blaming the crucifixion on everyone else when it was all ordained by God in the first place, right from the beginning, as we will read, as you may read in Acts 4. Including the trial process, which incriminated everybody here, not just Jews. With everyone being given plenty of time for sober second thoughts. Yep, they all knew exactly what they were doing. And Jesus does lay blame here as well. And he lays greater blame on the one who handed him over to Pilate in verse 11, which begs the operative question, who was that one? Well, Barrett suggests that Judas was probably the intended one here. Yeah, Judas. Well, then we have Tenney suggesting this to be referring to the high priest Caiaphas and the Jewish hierarchy, though I would be more inclined to blame sweet daddy Annas instead. Yeah, the priest behind the curtain. Whereas Calvin suggests this be referring to the riotous mob, the mob handing over the Son of Man to a mere man. A mob that just as easily includes you and me. However, I am more inclined to side with Carson here, that ultimately God was the one that handed him over. Yep, God did it. He handed him over to the cross around noontime, according to our NIV, the very meaning of the hour intended throughout the Gospel of John. You see all those references there. Almost like a paschal sacrifice, which we heard about in the sermon this morning. Yep, the Passover lamb. But that would be later in the afternoon when that sacrifice occurred. He handed him over around the 6th hour. It says 6th hour in our old NIV, to be perfectly transparent. 6th hour. Huh? which might mean 6 a.m. by Roman and our present timekeeping standards, but John wasn't Roman, and they didn't have our digital timepieces either. Now, Jewish days are guided by sunlight hours, with Mark 15, verse 25, suggesting a crucifixion beginning around the third hour, which is what it says in our older NIV. Third hour by Jewish timekeeping. So it would appear that the mandatory flogging, which precedes the crucifixion, began around the third hour after sunrise, which is 9 o'clock in the morning according to our NIV. The mandatory flogging, which was an integral part of the crucifixion, a major flogging to hasten death before sunset in this case. Why? Well, the following day was the Sabbath, with the sunset marking the upcoming Sabbath, when rest was supposed to be observed by observant Jews. However, according to Barrett, the nailing to the cross began at the third hour, so John was simply wrong about the 6th hour. With Barrett claiming that the Greek numerals 3 and 6 look awfully similar, so there may have been a transcription error along the way, except there is no manuscript evidence supporting that conjecture. No, there is zero evidence of numerals being used here at all. Also, Barrett appears to have overlooked something called the imperfect aspect of the aorist, which is some Greek grammar thing. Which is to say that the third hour could very well be just the beginning of the end. Just the beginning of the end. Just as Jesus would say, the hour has come several days earlier, which we read in John chapter 12. Even today, when we say we are being crucified, it is not exactly on a cross. And taking up your cross is not entirely taken literally either. No. Yet even Barrett isn't terribly bothered by this apparent contradiction. And he doesn't mention the unscrupulous revision of later manuscripts that conform the account of Mark to John and vice versa. They switch the hours around. Calvin's explanation on this is just wonky. It's not worth considering. Well, Carson basically suggests that, well, time flies while you're having fun. And they weren't wearing sundials at the time. He's a little too flippant about this. Just like I was a little too flippant about digital watches and whatnot. Because unraveling Barrett can be pretty tiresome. Well, not that crucifixion is fun. It was real and not just some metaphorical proposition by some ethereal Docetus, somebody who doesn't really believe in this real crucifixion of the body. Hence the account of real blood and water flowing from the side of Jesus. And any sacramental parallels are simply mental, according to Carson. And then there is the silly dispute over whether Jesus actually drank wine vinegar. A dispute primarily made by the anti-alcohol movement of about 100 years ago, when in all likelihood Jesus did indeed drink the wine to fulfill yet another prophecy, and not just wet his lips, just as John makes reference to Jesus fulfilling numerous other prophecies. And then, of course, we have Barrett. Barrett again. Suggesting that John was not actually there with respect to verse 35. He wasn't there? with even a reason suggesting that the soldier with the spear wrote this account. Good grief. Barrett's primary argument against John not being there has been expertly dismantled by Carson. You can read that if you ever want to do that. And this verse is simply the simplest explanation of that grammatical device, and it concurs with chapter 21, 24, and it concurs with chapter 114. Then, towards the finish of this chapter, verse 40, we have the claim that Jesus was wrapped up in strips of linen. How did that work? Wrapped up in strips of linen. There's dispute about that. Kind of wrapped up like these strips, perhaps. And what they think, I think Jesus, I don't have a hockey stick, but okay. So they had this myrrh that we were talking about earlier being put between the folds, the sticky myrrh being put between the folds or on the strips itself. You know? Just to contain all this stuff. Right where it's supposed to be, so it doesn't all fall off. And then there is a dispute in Mark where it's considered to be a whole cloth. A whole cloth instead of strips of linen. And so, but that's mostly and that's where this Shroud of Turin, if you're familiar with the Shroud of Turin at all, it was supposed to be a whole cloth. And Calvin disputes that too, because that shroud was around in his time. And so we're going to dismantle that a little bit more a little later on, another chapter, next chapter. But the Greek word in Mark is only indicating that it was linen, not necessarily a whole cloth. And this wrapping was probably accomplished with the help of some servants of Joe and Nikki, since that not unusual weight amount of myrrh mixture, was pretty heavy for one man, like 75 pounds, or someone else calculated 65.054 pounds or something. And also taking a dead weight down from the cross would have been pretty tricky by one man as well. So quite likely they had some servants involved as well. So you're probably hoping that I'm finished this now, right? Yeah, okay. Finished with this gory story, but not until I finish that it is finished claim, since that is where the story really ends. That is where the hour ends. That is where our salvation begins. Here we go. And to that end, I'm going to leave you a quote from Calvin. Calvin says, "Let us stop here, therefore, if we do not choose to be deprived of the salvation which he has procured for us. But the whole religion of popery," Roman Catholics, "tends to lead men to contrive for themselves innumerable methods of seeking salvation. And hence we infer that it is full to overflowing with abominable sacrileges. More especially this word of Christ seized. For the salvation of men has been completed by one sacrifice of the death of Christ. What right then have the papists of what plausible excuse can they assign for saying that they are authorized to prepare a new sacrifice to reconcile God to men? They reply, it is not a new sacrifice, but the very sacrifice which Christ offered. But this is easily refuted. For in the first place, they have no command to offer it. And secondly, Christ, having once accomplished by a single oblation all that was necessary to be done, declares from the cross that all is finished. Amen.